Chapter 11. Game mechanics must be in balance. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 1. Have you ever looked forward to playing a game that you were certain was going to be incredibly fun, only to be terribly disappointed? This game had a story that sounded interesting, the kind of gameplay action that is your favorite, cutting-edge technology, and beautiful artwork, but somehow the play was monotonous, confusing, and frustrating. This is a game that is out of balance. To novice designers, the business of balancing a game seems quite mysterious, but really, balancing a game is nothing more than adjusting the elements of the game until they deliver the experience you want. Balancing a game is far from a science. In fact, despite the simple mathematics that is often involved, it is generally considered the most artful part of game design, for it is all about understanding subtle nuances in the relationships between the elements of your game and knowing which ones to alter, how much to alter them, and which ones to leave alone. Part of what makes game balancing so difficult is that no two games are alike, and every game has many different factors that need to be in balance. As a designer, you must discern what elements in your game needs to be balanced, and then experiment with changing them until you have them generating exactly the experience you want your players to have. Think of it like creating a new recipe. It is one thing to determine the ingredients you need, but another to decide how much of each to use and how they should be combined. Some of the decisions you make will be based in hard mathematics. 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder leaves 1 cup of flour. But others, like how much sugar to use, are often a matter of personal taste. A skilled chef can make the simplest of recipes a delight to eat for the same reason a skilled game designer can make the simplest of games a delight to play. They both know how to balance the ingredients. Game balancing can come in a variety of forms because every different game has different things that must be brought into balance. Still, there are some patterns of balance that occur over and over again. Balancing a game is all about examining it carefully, so this chapter will be rich with many lenses. The 12 most common types of game balance. Balance type number 1, fairness. Symmetrical games. One quality that players universally seek in games is fairness. Players want to feel that the forces working against them do not have an advantage that will make them impossible to defeat. One of the simplest ways to ensure this is to make sure your game is symmetrical. That is, to give equal resources and powers to all players. Most traditional board games, such as checkers, chess, and Monopoly, and almost all sports use this method to be sure that no player has an unfair advantage over another. If you want to put players in direct competition with one another, and you expect them to have roughly equal levels of skill, symmetric games are a great choice. They are particularly good systems for determining which player is the best, since all things in the game are equal, but for the skill and strategy that the individual players bring to the game. In these games, perfect symmetry is not always possible, as there is often some minor issue, such as who goes first or who starts with the ball, that gives one side a small advantage over the other. Generally, random selection, such as a coin toss or die roll, is the solution. Though it gives one player a small advantage, over many games the advantage is distributed evenly. In some cases, the way this asymmetry is remedied is by giving the advantage to the player with the least skill, such as youngest player goes first. This is an elegant way to use the natural imbalance of the game to help balance the skill levels of the players. Asymmetrical games. It is also possible, and often desirable, to give opponents different resources and abilities. If you do, be aware that you have a significant balancing task ahead of you. Here are some of the reasons you might create an asymmetrical game. To simulate a real-world situation. If the point of your game is to simulate the battle between Axis and Allied forces during World War II, a symmetrical game does not make sense, since the real-world conflict was not symmetrical. 2. To give players another way to explore the game space. Exploration is one of the great pleasures of gameplay. Players often enjoy exploring the possibilities of playing the same game with different powers and resources. In a fighting game, for example, if 2 players have 10 different fighters to choose from, each with different powers, there are 10 times 10 different pairings, each which requires different strategies and effectively you have turned one game into 100 games. 3. Personalization. Different players bring different skills to a game. If you give the players a choice of powers and resources that best matches their own skills, it makes them feel powerful. They have been able to shape the game to emphasize the thing they are best at. 4. To level the playing field. Sometimes your opponents have radically different skill levels. This is especially true if you have opponents that are computer controlled. Consider the game of Pac-Man. It would be more symmetrical if there were just one ghost chasing Pac-Man, not 4. But if that was the case, the player would win easily, for a human can easily outwit a computer when it comes to navigating a maze. But to outwit 4 computer-controlled opponents at once brings the game into balance and gives the computer a fair chance of defeating the player. Some games are customizable in this regard. A golf handicap, for example, lets players of different levels compete at the challenge levels they will both enjoy. Whether to introduce this kind of balancing depends on whether your game is meant to be a standard measure of player skill, or whether the goal is to provide challenge to all players. 5. To create interesting situations. In the infinite space of all the games that can be created, many more of them are asymmetrical than are symmetrical. Pitting asymmetrical forces against each other can often be interesting and thought-provoking for the players, since it is not always obvious what the right strategies will be to win the game. Players become naturally curious about whether one side or another has an advantage, and they will often spend a great deal of time and thought to try to decide whether the game is truly fair. The game of Baga Chal, the official board game of Nepal, is an excellent example of this. In this game, not only do the players have unequal forces, they also have different goals. One player controls 5 tigers, while the other controls 20 goats. The tiger player wins by eating 5 goats, and the goat player wins by positioning the goats so that no tiger can move. Though it is generally acknowledged by experienced players that the game is balanced, novices to the game spend a great deal of time discussing whether one side or the other has particular advantage, and playing the game over and over, trying to determine the best strategies and counter strategies. It can be quite difficult to properly adjust resources and powers in an asymmetrical game to make them feel evenly matched. The most common method of doing so is to assign a value to each resource or power and make sure that the sum of the values is equal for both sides. See the following section for an example. Biplane battle. Imagine a game of biplane dogfight combat. Each player gets to choose one of the following planes. Plane, Piranha, speed is medium, maneuverability medium, firepower medium. Another plane, the Revenger, has a high speed, high maneuverability, and low firepower. And the next plane, the Sopwith Camel, has low speed, low maneuverability, but medium firepower. Are these planes equally balanced? It is hard to say. At first glance, though, we might evaluate all 3 categories by saying low is 1, medium is 2, and high is 3. This gives us new information. The Piranha has a total of 6, Revenger has a total of 7, and Sopwith Camel has a total of 4. Looked at from this point of view, the player with the Revenger seems to have an unfair advantage over the others, and that may be the case. But after playing the game a little, maybe we notice that the Piranha and the Revenger seem evenly matched, but players who fly the Sopwith Camel generally lose. This might lead us to speculate that firepower is more valuable than the other categories, maybe twice as valuable. In other words, for the firepower column, low is 2, medium is 4, and high is 6. This gives us a new table with Piranha as 8, Revenger as 8, but Sopwith Camel as 6. This gives us totals that match our observation of the game in action. We may now have a model that shows us how to balance the game to make it fair. To test our theory, we might change the firepower for the Sopwith Camel to be high, or 6, giving us a new table. Each plane has a total of 8. It would appear that if our model is correct, these 3 planes are equally balanced, but that's only a theory. The way we find out is by playtesting the game. If we play and determine that gameplay feels roughly fair no matter which plane you use, then our model is correct. It would appear that if our model is correct, these 3 planes are equally balanced, but that's only a theory, a game theory. The way we find out is by playtesting the game. If we play and determine that gameplay feels roughly fair, no matter which plane you use, then our model is correct. But what if we play and realize that the Sopwith Camel is still losing battles? In that case, we will have to make a new speculation, change our model, rebalance, and try playing again. It is important to note that the act of balancing and developing a model of how to balance go hand in hand. As you balance, you learn more about relationships in the game, and you can make a better mathematical model that represents these relationships. And as you change the model, you learn more about the right way to balance your game. The model informs the balance, and the balancing informs the model. Also note that balancing a game can only really begin once the game is playable. Many a game has suffered in the marketplace because all the time in the schedule got used up just getting the game to work, and not enough time was allotted to balance the game before it needed to go to market. There's an old rule of thumb that it takes 6 months to balance your game after you have a completely working version, but this varies a great deal depending on the type and scope of your game. Certainly, the more new gameplay elements you have, the longer it will take you to balance it properly. Rock, paper, scissors. One simple way to balance elements for fairness is to make sure that whenever something in your game has an advantage over something else, yet another thing has an advantage over that. The iconic example of this is the game of rock, paper, scissors, where rock breaks scissors, scissors cut paper, and paper covers rock. None of the elements can be supreme, because there's always another that can defeat it. It is a simple way to ensure that every game element has both strengths and weaknesses. Fighting games particularly like to use this technique to help ensure that none of the warriors a player might choose are undefeatable. Balancing your game to make it feel fair is one of the fundamental types of game balancing. You surely want to use the lens of fairness on any game you create. Lens number 30, the lens of fairness. To use the lens of fairness, think carefully about the game from each player's point of view. Taking into account each player's skill level, find a way to give each player a chance of winning that each will consider to be fair. Ask yourself these questions. Should my game be symmetrical? Why? Should my game be asymmetrical? And why? Which is more important, that my game is a reliable measure of who has the most skill, or that it provides an interesting challenge to all players? If I want players of different skill levels to play together, what means will I use to make the game interesting and challenging for everyone? Fairness can be a slippery subject. There are some cases where one side has an advantage over the other, and the game still seems fair. Sometimes this is so that players of unequal skill can play together, but there can be other reasons. In the game Alien vs. Predator, for example, it is generally recognized that in multiplayer mode, predators have a significant advantage over the aliens. Players do not consider it to be unfair, however, because it is in keeping with the Alien vs. Predator story world, and they accept that if they play as an alien, they will be at a disadvantage and will need to compensate for that with extra skill. It is a badge of pride among players to be able to win the game when playing as an alien. Balance type number 2, challenge versus success. Let us revisit this diagram from chapter 9. We know that keeping the player in the flow channel is desirable. If play is too challenging, the player becomes frustrated. But if the player succeeds too easily, they become bored. Keeping the player on the middle path means keeping the experiences of challenge and success in proper balance. This can be particularly difficult since players may have all different levels of skill. What one player finds boring, another might find challenging, and yet another might find frustrating. Some common techniques for striking a proper balance include increased difficulty with each success, and this is a very common pattern in video games. Each level is harder than the last. Players build their skill until they can complete a level, only to be presented with one that challenges them yet again. Don't forget, of course, to use the tense and release pattern shown above. Let player get through easy parts fast. Assuming your game has some method of gradually increasing the difficulty, you do yourself a service by allowing skilled players to finish their levels quickly if they can easily master it. This way, skilled players will blow through easy levels quickly getting to a challenge that is more interesting to them, while less skilled players will be challenged by the early levels. This lets every player quickly get to the part of the game that is a challenge. If you arrange it differently, such that each level takes 1 hour to play, regardless of skill level, skilled players may quickly grow bored from the lack of challenge. Create layers of challenge. A popular pattern in games is to give a grade at the end of each level or mission. If you get a D or F, you must repeat the level, but if you get a C or better, you can continue. This creates a situation with a lot of flexibility in how you can play it. Novice players are thrilled to get a C and unlock the next level. As they gain experience and have unlocked all the levels, they may set themselves a new challenge to earn an A or even A+ on earlier levels. Let players choose the difficulty level. A tried and true method is to let players choose to play on easy, medium, or hard modes. Some games, many Atari 2600 games, for example, even let you change the difficulty level mid-game. The upside of this is that players can quickly find the appropriate challenge level for their skill. The downside is that you have to create and balance multiple versions of your game. Also, it can detract from the reality of your game. Players will argue over which version is the real one, or be left feeling unsure whether any of them are real. Playtest with a variety of players. Many designers fall into the trap of only testing with people who are constantly exposed to the game and end up designing a game that is too frustrating for novices. Others fall into the opposite trap and only test their game with people who have never played before. They end up designing a game that experienced players quickly grow bored with. Wise designers playtest with a mix of skilled and novice players to be sure that their game is fun at first, fun after a while, and fun much, much later. One of the toughest challenges in game balancing is deciding how difficult the game should get over time. Many designers are so afraid of players beating their game too easily that they make later levels so fiendishly difficult to win that 90% of players eventually give up on the game in frustration. These designers hope that the increased challenge will extend the playtime, and there is something to that. If you have expended 40 hours to get through level 9, you'll probably be willing to work pretty hard to defeat level 10. But in truth, there are so many competing games to play, many players just give up in frustration. As a designer, it makes sense to ask yourself, what percentage of players do I want to be able to complete the game? And then design for that. And don't forget, just learning to play a game at all is a challenge. For this reason, the first level or two of a game are often incredibly simplistic. The player is so challenged just trying to understand the controls and goals that any additional challenge might push them right into frustration. Not to mention the fact that a few early successes can do a lot to build a player's confidence. A confident player will give up less easily on the game. Challenge is a core element of gameplay and can be so difficult to balance that it merits its own lens. Lens number 31, the lens of challenge. Challenge is at the core of almost all gameplay. You could even say that a game is defined by its goals and challenges. When examining the challenges in your game, ask yourself these questions. What are the challenges in my game? Are they too easy, too hard, or just right? Can my challenges accommodate a wide variety of skill levels? How does the level of challenge increase as the player succeeds? Is there enough variety in the challenges? What is the maximum level of challenge in my game? Balance type number 3, meaningful choices. There are many different ways to give a player choices in a game. Meaningful choices for a player lead them to ask themselves questions such as, where should I go? How should I spend my resources? What should I practice and try to perfect? How should I dress my character? Should I try to get through the game quickly or carefully? Should I focus on offense or defense? What strategy should I use in this situation? Which power should I choose? Should I play it safe or take a big risk? A good game gives the player meaningful choices. Not just any choices, but choices that will have a real impact on what happens next and how the game turns out. Many designers fall into the trap of offering the player meaningless choices. For example, in a racing game, you might have 50 vehicles to choose from, but if they all drive the same way, it is like having no choice at all. Other designers fall into a different trap, offering choices that no one would want. You might offer a soldier 10 guns, all different, but if no one of them is clearly better than the rest, again, it is like having no choice at all. When choices are offered to a player, but one of them is clearly better than the rest, this is called a dominant strategy. Once a dominant strategy is discovered, the game is no longer fun, because the puzzle of the game has been solved. There are no more choices to make. When you discover that a game you are working on has a dominant strategy, you must change the rules or balance things so that this strategy no longer dominates, and meaningful choice can be restored to the game. The previous biplane battle example is an example of just that, a designer trying to balance a game to remove a dominant strategy and restore meaningful choice to the players. Hidden dominant strategies that are discovered by players are often referred to as exploits, since they can be exploited by players to take a shortcut to success that the designer never intended. In early development of a game, dominant strategies abound. As the game continues development, these strategies start to get properly balanced. Paradoxically, this often throws novice designers into a panic. Yesterday, I understand the right way to play this game, but with these new changes, I'm not sure about the right way to play it. They feel like they have just lost their handle on their own game, but in reality, the game has just taken a big step forward. It no longer has a dominant strategy, and now there are meaningful choices to be made. Instead of fearing this moment, you should cherish it and take the opportunity to see if you can understand why the current configuration of rules and values is putting your game into balance. But this leads to another question. How many meaningful choices should we give to a player? Michael Mateus points out that the number of choices a player seeks is dependent on the number of things they desire. If choices is greater than desires, then the player is overwhelmed. If choices is less than desires, the player is frustrated. But if choices equals desires, the player has a feeling of freedom and fulfillment. So, to properly determine the number of choices, you need to figure out the types and number of things that the player would like to do. In some situations, the player wants only a small number of meaningful choices. Choosing to take the left or right fork in the road is interesting. Choosing to take one of 30 side roads is overwhelming. Other times, a huge number of choices are desired. For example, a clothes shopping interface in The Sims. Meaningful choices are the heart of interactivity, and having a lens to examine them is quite useful. Lens number 32, the lens of meaningful choices. When we make meaningful choices, it lets us feel like the things we do matter. To use this lens, ask yourself these questions. What choices am I asking the player to make? Are they meaningful, and how? Am I giving the player the right number of choices? Would more make them feel more powerful? Would less make the game clearer? Are there any dominant strategies in my game? Triangularity. One of the most exciting and interesting choices for a player to make is whether to play it safe and go for a small reward, or take a big risk to try for a big reward. This is a hard decision to make if the game is balanced properly. I find that about 8 out of 10 times someone comes to me asking for help on a game prototype that just isn't fun. The game is missing this kind of meaningful choice. You could call this balanced asymmetric risk, since you are balancing the low risk with low reward against the high risk for high reward. But that is kind of a mouthful. This relationship comes up so often and is so important that I like to give it a shorter name, triangularity. The player is at one point of a triangle, and the low risk choice is the second point, and the high risk choice is the third. An example of a game that has good triangularity is Space Invaders. Most of the time in the game, you are shooting at low point aliens near your ship worth 10, 20, and 30 points. They are slow moving and easy to shoot, and shooting them makes you safer because it stops them from dropping bombs on you. Every once in a while, however, a little red flying saucer flies across the top of the screen. It poses no threat and is quite difficult and dangerous to shoot. It is difficult because it is moving and far away, and dangerous because to properly aim at it, you have to take your eyes off your ship and look at it, and you risk getting hit by a bomb. However, it is worth between 100 and 300 points. Without the flying saucer, Space Invaders gets quite tedious because your choices are few. You just shoot and shoot and shoot. With the flying saucer, you occasionally have a very difficult, meaningful choice to make. Should you play it safe or take a risk and go for the big points? Triangularity is so important that it gets its own lens. Lens number 33, the lens of triangularity. Giving a player the choice to play it safe for a low reward or to take a risk for a big reward is a great way to make your game interesting and exciting. To use the lens of triangularity, ask yourself these questions. Do I have triangularity now? If not, how can I get it? Is my attempt at triangularity balanced? That is, are the rewards commensurate with the risks? Once you start looking for triangularity in games, you will see it everywhere. A dull, monotonous game can quickly become exciting and rewarding when you add a dash of triangularity. A good way to make sure your triangularity is balanced is to use lens number 28, the lens of expected value. The classic game of kicks provides an interesting example of balancing with expected values. In it, you try to draw rectangular shapes to surround territory on a blank game board. While you do this, a blob of lines, called the kicks, floats around the board at random. If the kicks touches one of your rectangles before you finish drawing it, you die. But if you finish drawing the rectangle, then you claim that area of the board. When you have covered 75% of the board, you win the level. The designers of the game give the player a very explicit choice. Each time he draws a rectangle, he can either move quickly, drawing a blue rectangle, or at a half speed, drawing an orange rectangle. Since moving at half speed is twice as dangerous, rectangles drawn at half speed are given double the points. This works because if we assume that the chance of successfully drawing a fast blue rectangle is 20% and it is worth 100 points, then the expected value of attempting to draw one is 100 points times 20%, which is 20 points. We also know that drawing a rectangle at half speed has half the chance of succeeding, so we get a table that looks like speed, slow, orange, chance of success is 10%, points is question mark, and expected value is 20. We want the game to be balanced, so we keep the expected value constant. It is pretty easy to see that if we want the game to be balanced, the point value should be 200 points for the same size slow rectangle. The difficult part with this kind of thing is figuring out the chance of success. We often have to estimate, but this is another case where the model informs the prototype, and testing the prototype informs the model, creating a virtuous cycle where eventually the model is correct and the game is balanced. Balancing type number 4, skill versus chance. In Chapter 10, we talked in detail about the mechanics of skill and chance. In a real sense, these are two opposing forces in any game design. Too much chance negates the effect of players' skill and vice versa. There's no easy answer for this one. Some players prefer games with as few elements of chance as possible, and other players prefer the opposite. Games of skill tend to be more like athletic contests, systems of judgment that determine which player is best. Games of chance often have a more relaxed, casual nature. After all, much of the outcome is up to fate. To strike the balance, you must use lens number 16, the lens of the player, to understand how much skill and how much chance will be the right amount for the audience of your game. Differences in preference are sometimes determined by age or gender, and sometimes even by culture. For example, German board game players seem to prefer games that minimize the effects of chance more so than American players. One very common method of balancing these is to alternate the use of chance and skill in a game. For example, dealing out a hand of cards is pure chance, but choosing how to play them is pure skill. Rolling a die to see how far you move is pure chance. Deciding where to move your piece is pure skill. This can create an alternating pattern of tension and relaxation that can be very pleasing to players. Choosing how to balance skill and chance will determine the character of your game. Examine it closely with this lens. Lens number 34, the lens of skill versus chance. To help determine how to balance skill and chance in your game, ask yourself these questions. Are my players here to be judged, which is skill, or to take risks, chance? Skill tends to be more serious than chance. Is my game serious or casual? Are parts of my game tedious? If so, will adding elements of chance enliven them? Do parts of my game feel too random? If so, will replacing elements of chance with elements of skill or strategy make the players feel more in control? Balancing type number 5, head versus hands. This type of balancing is quite straightforward. How much of the game should involve doing a challenging physical activity, be it steering, throwing, or pushing buttons dexterously, and how much of it should involve thinking. These two things are not as separate as they might seem on the surface. Many games involve constant strategizing and puzzle solving while simultaneously pulling off feats of speed and dexterity. Other games alternate the two types of gameplay for variety. Consider the action platform game genre. You work your way through a level, dexterously guiding your avatar to jump over obstacles, and maybe shooting at enemies, occasionally pausing to solve some small puzzle that prevents you from clearing that level. Often, the intensity is increased at the end of a level by a boss monster who can only be defeated through a mix of puzzle solving. Oh, I have to jump on this tail, and that makes him drop his shield for a second. And dexterity, I only have a second to shoot an arrow into that narrow gap. It is important, though, to understand what your target market prefers in a game, more thinking or more dexterity. And it is equally important that your game clearly communicate what balance you have chosen to put into it. Consider the very unusual game Pac-Man 2, The New Adventures for the Sega Genesis. The name suggested that it would be a game of action and a little strategy, like the original Pac-Man, but a quick glance at the box told another story. This appeared to be a 2D platform game like Super Mario Bros. Or Sonic the Hedgehog, which meant action plus a little puzzle solving. But actually playing the game revealed something completely different. Though it visually looked like an action platform game, it was really a game of strange psychological puzzles where you subtly guide Pac-Man into different emotional states to get him to pass various obstacles. Players expecting mostly action and little thinking were disappointed. Players looking for a game about puzzle solving generally didn't play the game, rejecting it based on its action-based appearance. When Games Magazine reviews a video game, they give it a ranking on a sliding scale where one end is fingers and the other end is brain. It can be easy to forget that a game with a lot of button pushing can still involve a lot of thought and strategy. Use lens number 27, the lens of skill, to understand the different skills in your game, and then use this lens to balance those skills. Lens number 35, the lens of head and hands. Yogi Berra once said, baseball is 90% mental, the other half is physical. To make sure your game has a more realistic balance of mental and physical elements, use the lens of head and hands. Ask yourself these questions. Are my players looking for mindless action or an intellectual challenge? Would adding more places that involve puzzle solving in my game make it more interesting? Are there places where the player can relax their brain and just play the game without thinking? Can I give the player a choice, either succeed by exercising a high level of dexterity or by finding a clever strategy that works with a minimum of physical skill? If 1 means physical and 10 means all mental, what number would my game get? This lens works particularly well when used in conjunction with lens number 16, lens of the player. Balance type number 6, competition versus cooperation. Competition and cooperation are basic animal urges. All higher animals are driven to compete against others partly for survival and partly to establish their status in the community. Opposite of that, there's also a basic instinct to cooperate with others, since a team with its many eyes and hands and its diverse abilities is always more powerful than an individual. Competition and cooperation are so important to our survival that we need to experiment with them, partly to get better at them and partly to learn about our friends and family, so we get a better sense of who is good at what and how we can work together. Games provide a very socially safe way to explore how the people around us behave in stressful situations. This is a secret reason we like to play games together. When it comes to games, competitive games are more common than cooperative ones, though some very interesting cooperative games have been created. Cookie and Cream for the PlayStation 2 is an action platform puzzle game where 2 players play side by side on parallel paths trying to get through a level. And Rainer Kniza's Lord of the Rings board game is a fascinating example of a game where the players do not compete at all, but instead coordinate their efforts in an attempt to win the game together. Some games find interesting ways to blend competition and cooperation. The arcade game Joust can be played solo, where a player competes against many computer-controlled enemies, or can be played in two-player mode, where both players compete against enemies together in the same arena. There's a tension between competition and cooperation in Joust that is very interesting. On the competitive side, the players get points based on how many enemies they defeat, and they can battle each other if they choose. But on the cooperative side, players can get higher scores overall if they coordinate their attacks and protect each other. It is up to the players to decide whether they are trying to beat each other, getting the highest relative score, or trying to beat the game, trying to get the highest absolute score. The game plays up this tension. Some levels are designated Team Wave. If both players can survive the level, they each get 3,000 points, bonus points. Other levels are designated Gladiator Wave. The first player who defeats another gets 3,000 points, bonus points. This interesting alternation between cooperation and competition gives the game a lot of variety and lets players explore whether their partner is more interested in cooperation or competition. And while competition and cooperation are polar opposites, they can be quite conveniently combined into a situation where you get the best of both. How? Through team competition. Common in athletic sports, the rise of network games has allowed team competition to grow and thrive in the world of video games. Competition and cooperation are so important that we need 3 lenses to examine them properly. Lens number 36, the lens of competition. Determining who is most skilled at something is a basic human urge. Games of competition can satisfy that urge. Use this lens to be sure your competitive game makes people want to win it. Ask yourself these questions. Does my game give a fair measurement of player skill? Do players want to win my game, and why? Is winning this game something people can be proud of, and why? Can novices meaningfully compete at my game? Can experts meaningfully compete at my game? Can experts generally be sure they will defeat novices? Lens number 37, the lens of cooperation. Collaborating and succeeding as a team is a special pleasure that can create lasting social bonds. Use this lens to study the cooperative aspects of your game. Ask these questions. Cooperation requires communication. Do my players have enough opportunity to communicate? How could communication be enhanced? Are my players friends already, or are they strangers? If they are strangers, can I help them break the ice? Is there synergy, 2 plus 2 equals 5, or antergy, 2 plus 2 equals 3, when the players work together, and why? Do all the players have the same role, or do they have special jobs? Cooperation is greatly enhanced when there is no way an individual can do a task alone. Tasks that force communication inspire cooperation. Do any of my tasks, force communication? Lens number 38, the lens of competition versus cooperation. Balancing competition and cooperation can be done in many interesting ways. Use this lens to decide whether they are balanced properly in your game. Ask yourself these questions. If 1 is competition and 10 is cooperation, what number should my game get? Can I give players a choice whether to play cooperatively or competitively? Does my audience prefer competition, cooperation, or a mix? Is team competition something that makes sense for my game? Is my game more fun with team competition or with solo competition? As more and more games go online, more opportunities for different types of competition and collaboration become available, from casual multiplayer games of chess between 2 people to competing guilds of thousands of players in MMORPGs. But the psychological forces that drive us to enjoy competition and cooperation have not changed. The better you can understand and balance these forces, the stronger your game will become.